This is the Fujifilm GFX100, a 100 megapixel medium format digital camera. So the GFX100 takes its DNA primarily from 35mm SLR cameras as opposed to a medium format SLR. What surprised me most about this camera was how similar it was to a Fuji XT3. So this camera comes in at $10,000, which might seem like a ridiculous amount of money for a camera. It's priced around the same as a top-tier DSLR. I've had the chance to use a few digital medium format cameras, and this camera by far is the easiest and most reliable to use. This camera feels exactly like a Fuji XT3 in the way that it performs and the way that it handles. To me, it just felt like I was using a differently shaped Fuji XT3. Now that's awesome. That couldn't be said about the Hasselblad H6D. That camera was a very different type of camera. It was more of a hybrid between an old Hasselblad and a digital camera, where the camera itself had its own electronic. The digital sensor back was actually the camera, and that had its own electronic system as well too, and sometimes it didn't communicate well. But this camera feels exactly like you're using an XT3, but with that much, much larger sensor. So it was a really, really cool experience, super seamless. The images that came out of it are just ridiculous for something that you can just easily walk around with. So when you first pick up this camera, you're going to be astounded by how light it is. Generally, I'm not as huge a fan of SLR styled cameras. That being said, this is probably one of the coolest looking cameras that I've ever seen. It's such a futuristic, modern looking design with these super clean lines and this really awesome looking like gray silver finish that is just so cool looking to me. The leather feels really cool on it as well too. It has these little OLED screens. It's just such an awesome looking camera, and it's definitely unique to Fujifilm. All the Canon, Nikon DSLRs all look like the Canon DSLRs, but just like bigger with a built-in grip. This camera looks more modern than the current Fuji cameras. I would love it if they passed this kind of design styling down to the XT3 in the future. That would be amazing. This camera looks like some crazy cyberpunk camera to me. One of my favorite parts about using the GFX100 was that it had an X-Pan crop mode. It's a 64x25 crop, so you basically get that 235mm frame width image crop straight out of the camera. And being a 100 megapixel image sensor, that crop, that very drastic crop, was still 50 megapixels. I crop all of my images anyway to a similar aspect ratio. I really don't care about resolution that much. To me, I wish that feature was on all of Fuji's cameras, but I know they don't put it on there because the resolution loss. Using this 100 megapixel sensor, you still end up with a 50 megapixel image when you crop it that drastically. But to me, it's just super satisfying and fun to walk around and be able to preview your images in that cinematic kind of crop mode. So it's basically like walking around with a digital X-Pan. It's about as close as you can get other than like the GFX50R, but the autofocus on this camera is drastically better than the 50R. Not only is this a medium format camera capable of 400 megabits per second, 10-bit video, it also has modern phase detection autofocus, in-body image stabilization, and ridiculously good battery life. I took this camera on a trip to New York, and I charged the batteries once before leaving, and I was gone for 5 days, and I never charged the battery once while I was in New York. I didn't shoot a ton of video, but I shot a lot of photos, and I was astounded that I did not need to charge the battery at all. But that's really what's special about this camera. It's a medium format SLR sized camera that has modern autofocus conveniences and video performance that you would expect from something like an A7 or an X-T3. The autofocus isn't as good for video, at least in the small amount that I tested it, but it works about the same as some of the older autofocusing lenses on the X-T3. It's a little jittery, but in terms of autofocus speed for shooting stills, it's fast enough. If you're planning on getting this camera to do video, I don't really recommend using autofocus for video other than this situation right now where I'm filming myself and can't focus the lens. Otherwise, 100% of the time I'm using manual focus to shoot video. So the autofocus speed on the Fuji lenses on the GFX wouldn't really concern me at all because I'd always be using manual focus when I'm shooting video anyway. Now, one of the things I was most interested to try out with this camera was anamorphic. I took my anamorphic adapter and converted it such that I could use it on this camera with the 110mm, as well as a Hasselblad 80mm lens from my Hasselblad 500cm. This camera has a native 4:3 aspect ratio sensor, which is perfect for doing 2x anamorphic work. I attached my Sancor 16C anamorphic to this camera and had a lot of fun shooting some images with it. In addition to images, I also shot the footage that you saw at the beginning of this video in anamorphic. Fujifilm markets this camera as a large format camera, and technically they're not wrong. Large format is the term used in cinema to refer to any camera that has a larger sensor than 35mm film, which is about an APS-C size sensor. Technically, a full-frame camera is considered large format in the cinema world. What's so exciting about this camera to me is that for $10,000, or even less if you rent it for a couple days, you can get a camera and shoot a short film on what amounts to an indie IMAX camera. And now, other people aren't really getting this quality of footage from other types of cameras. And for an indie short film, you couldn't ever rent an IMAX camera or an Alexa 65 for any practical amount of time. This really opens up doors for indie filmmakers to get a similar looking aesthetic to an Alexa 65 or an IMAX camera for fractions of the cost, for something that's easily rentable, even costing less than the cheaper cinema cameras. To get that different sort of perspective, field of view, depth of field that you get from the medium format cameras, in a camera that's $10,000, you can easily adapt lenses to it. You can use a whole slew of medium format lenses. It shoots 4K 10-bit, 400 megabits per second footage, DCI 4K. Fujifilm did shoot a whole video series all on the GFX100 for the launch of the X Pro 3. That stuff looked really awesome. So I would really love to see indie filmmakers picking up this camera and shooting films on it instead of something like a Red or a Blackmagic Ursa or something like that. I think it would be a really cool way to differentiate yourself from other people and get a look that really isn't possible unless you go up to $100,000 plus cameras. That to me is an extremely compelling reason to get this camera, since the video quality is good enough for doing indie filmmaking. I see this camera as a paradigm shift in photography. It's the first medium format camera that functions and works just as easily and as conveniently as your typical mirrorless camera. This is really a huge step forward in terms of bringing medium format to the everyday person. It's basically merging the two worlds of medium format and mirrorless 35mm full frame APS-C. It's kind of mixing those two worlds together with offering, the new bells and whistles of, your current mirrorless cameras, as well as the image quality, resolution, lens selections of a medium format camera. Fuji has cheaper alternatives to this camera with the GFX50R, and I think in a couple of years, when the features and reliability and performance of this camera trickles down to the cheaper cost medium format mirrorless cameras, it's really going to make full frame difficult to choose over the alternative.